In the history of the Third Reich, few figures are as contradictory as Hermann Göring, decorated war hero, commander of the Luftwaffe, second in the Nazi line of succession, obsessive collector, and morphine addict. A man who cultivated an image of warrior virility while sporting extravagant uniforms, ostentatious jewelry, and makeup in his public appearances. But behind that facade of power and eccentricity, persistent rumors about his sexuality circulated for decades. Whispers in Nazi power circles, testimonies from contemporaries, and analyses by modern historians have fueled an uncomfortable question. Was Hermann Göring homosexual? This is not a matter of historical morbidity. It is a question that forces us to examine how power operated in the Nazi regime, how reputations were built and destroyed, and how propaganda could turn rumors into political weapons. Today we unravel one of the most controversial mysteries of the Third Reich. Welcome to Wartime Archive. The man behind the uniform. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on January 12, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria, into a family with aristocratic and colonial connections. His father, Heinrich Ernst Göring, had been Governor-General of German Southwest Africa, and his mother, Franziska Tiefenbrunn, came from a prosperous Bavarian peasant family. This mixture of colonial origin and traditional roots would mark Hermann's contradictory personality from an early age. From his youth, he built a public image based on traditional military masculinity. During World War I, he became a flying ace, accumulating 22 confirmed kills and receiving the coveted Pour le Mérite, the highest Prussian military decoration. His bravery in combat was indisputable. He flew dangerous missions, led attack formations, and demonstrated the type of courage the German Imperial Army valued above all else. He commanded Jagdgeschwader 1 Squadron, Manfred von Richthofen's legendary flying circus, inheriting leadership of this elite unit after the death of the famous Red Baron. That war hero story was the pillar upon which Göring built his political career. When he met Hitler in 1922, his military prestige opened doors in nationalist circles that would otherwise have remained closed to the Nazi movement, still marginal and viewed with distrust by many conservative veterans. He participated in the failed Munich Putsch in 1923, where he was seriously wounded in the groin by shots from the Bavarian police, an injury that would mark the rest of his life in unexpected and profound ways. During his recovery in Austria, doctors administered morphine to control the intense pain from his wounds. What began as necessary medical treatment transformed into an addiction he could never overcome, and that would accompany him until his final days. This dependence progressively altered his physical appearance, his erratic behavior, his judgment capacity, and, according to some testimonies, his emotional stability. Morphine not only changed his body, bloating it and altering his facial features, but also modified his personality, making him more volatile, more prone to episodes of euphoria, followed by deep depression. As he rose to Nazi power during the 1930s, Göring developed habits that openly defied the masculinity norms the regime itself fanatically promoted. He designed his own uniforms, many of them with flashy colors totally foreign to German military sobriety, elaborate embroidery that seemed taken from Baroque operas, and theatrical cuts that no other Reich officer would have dared to wear. He used makeup to cover his skin imperfections, painted his nails with discreet but visible polish, and wore rings with precious stones on almost all his fingers, an ostentation that violently contrasted with traditional Prussian austerity. His main residence, Karinhall, named in honor of his first Swedish wife, Karin von Kansau, was a palace of almost megalomaniacal proportions, filled with artworks looted from Jewish collections and museums in occupied territories. Exotic animal skins hunted on safaris organized specifically for him, and overloaded decorations that mixed styles without any coherence. There he organized lavish dinners, where he appeared dressed in purple silk Roman tunics, outfits that seemed straight out of a Wagnerian opera production, or even completely anachronistic medieval hunting costumes. On one memorable occasion, documented by invited foreign diplomats, he appeared wearing an imperial purple toga, sandals with golden buckles encrusted with rubies, and carrying a Germanic ceremonial lance that he held like a scepter. These extravagant behaviors did not go unnoticed either inside or outside the party. Within the Nazi circle, His comrades mockingly nicknamed him Hermann the Fat, or simply the Fat Woman, terms that not only alluded to his progressively increasing weight, but carried an implicit burden of mockery toward his perceived effeminacy. Even Hitler, in private conversations meticulously recorded by his personal secretaries, made sarcastic comments about Göring's theatrical eccentricities, although he publicly defended him and kept him in positions of increasing power. But there was something deeper and more disturbing behind these superficial rumors about clothing and vanity. His ambivalent relationship with power, his pathological vanity bordering on megalomania, and certain extremely close personal bonds he secretly maintained with some young subordinates began to generate increasingly uncomfortable questions, especially after the bloody purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, where homosexuality was used as a pretext to eliminate political enemies. The Rome Connection and the Night of the Long Knives. To understand the rumors about Göring, it is impossible to ignore Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, the paramilitary storm troops of the Nazi Party known as the Brown Shirts. Röhm was openly homosexual in an era and environment where this represented a mortal risk, not only socially but also legally under the infamous paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code that criminalized homosexual relations. Unlike others who carefully concealed their sexual orientation, Röhm made no great effort to hide it. He frequented gay bars in Berlin and Munich, clandestine spaces but known to authorities, and maintained open relationships with young SA members, some of whom held leadership positions within the paramilitary organization. Hitler knew perfectly well about Röhm's sexual orientation from the early years of the Nazi movement, and for years tolerated it without major problems. Röhm was a highly decorated war veteran, with valuable connections in the conservative army, an extraordinarily effective military organizer who had built the SA from scratch, transforming them into a paramilitary force of hundreds of thousands of men, and one of Hitler's first and most loyal allies, when the Nazi Party was nothing more than a marginal group in Munich beer halls. His political and military usefulness far outweighed any moral objection the Führer might have had regarding his private life. However, by 1934, Röhm's homosexuality became a devastating political weapon in the hands of his enemies within the regime. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and architect of the Nazi terror system, and Hermann Göring, who already commanded the Gestapo in Prussia, with almost unlimited power over the secret police, began meticulously accumulating detailed dossiers on the moral degenerations within the SA. They collected names of homosexual members, testimonies from witnesses, and infiltrated informants, compromising photographs obtained through surveillance, and documentary evidence of organized homosexual networks operating openly within the paramilitary organization, protected by Röhm's authority. On June 30th, 1934, in what would go down in history as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered the summary execution of Röhm and hundreds of prominent SA members in a bloody purge that extended over several days. Officially, the operation was justified as a necessary preventive measure to avoid a supposed coup d'état that the SA were allegedly planning against Hitler and the government. But in reality, it was a systematic and carefully planned elimination of political rivals, whose growing power threatened both the regular German army and the personal ambitions of leaders like Göring and Himmler. The homosexuality of many of those executed was cynically used as a propaganda pretext to justify before German public opinion what was essentially a mass murder of political opponents. Göring played an absolutely central and personal role in the logistical organization of the executions. From his office in the Air Ministry in Berlin, he personally coordinated arrests throughout Prussia, drew up detailed lists of priority targets that included not only SA members, but also old personal enemies and political rivals, and directly supervised the firing squads that took place in military installations and Gestapo basements. His brutal efficiency and willingness to eliminate former comrades without hesitation in this bloody operation definitively consolidated his position as the second man of the Reich, just behind Hitler, and as one of the regime's most feared leaders. But here arises a deeply disturbing historical contradiction that has fascinated historians for decades. If Goering was so relentless and apparently ruthless in persecuting and eliminating homosexuals within the SA, using their sexual orientation as a weapon of political destruction, so why did such similar and persistent rumors circulate about him within the same Nazi power circles? Was it simply enemy propaganda fabricated by envious rivals? Or was there something substantial behind those accusations, whispered in the corridors of power? Several contemporaries left written records and oral testimonies suggesting a much more complex and ambiguous relationship between Göring and Röhm than official Nazi history publicly admitted. Otto Strasser, a dissident Nazi party member who broke with Hitler in 1930 and went into exile in Canada, where he wrote extensively about the regime's secrets, stated in his post-war published memoirs that Göring and Röhm had maintained a close and unusually intimate personal relationship in the chaotic early years of the Nazi movement during the 1920s, before divergent political ambitions and power struggles turned them into irreconcilable rivals. According to Strasser's detailed testimony, both frequented the same bohemian social circles in Munich during the turbulent 20s, an era of social experimentation and decadence in the Weimar Republic, and shared certain refined aesthetic tastes and artistic sensibilities that notably differentiated them from other, more austere, brutal, and less culturally sophisticated Nazi leaders. Strasser carefully insinuated, without stating it completely directly to avoid lawsuits, that this personal closeness had possibly included more intimate bonds of a sexual or romantic nature. Karl Ernst, another prominent SA leader and close confidant of Röhm who was executed during the Purge, had made revealing comments privately about shared secrets and mutual vulnerabilities among several members of the Nazi leadership, specifically mentioning Göring by name in conversations that were reported by informants. These explosive comments, carefully collected and documented by Gestapo informants infiltrated in the SA before his execution, were never officially investigated for obvious reasons, but remained archived in secret files that came to light decades later when the Allies captured Nazi archives. The key historical question that persists is chilling in its implications. Did Göring eliminate Röhm and actively participate in the SA massacre to genuinely protect the Nazi regime from a real political threat? Or did he do it fundamentally to protect himself from devastating exposure, eliminating someone who knew too much about his private life and his most intimate secrets? The rumors at the time. During World War II, British and American intelligence services collected information about the private lives of Nazi leaders, seeking weaknesses they could exploit. Declassified OSS, CIA predecessor files contained specific references to rumors about Göring's sexuality. A 1943 report classified Göring as possibly bisexual, based on testimonies from German exiles and deserters. The document mentioned his obsession with physical appearance, his theatrical behaviour, and ambiguous relationships with young subordinates. However, these reports lacked concrete evidence and were clearly biased by the stereotypes of the time. Allied propaganda, especially British, exploited these rumors. Political caricatures represented him with exaggeratedly effeminate features, wearing ridiculous clothes or in compromising situations. The goal was to dehumanize him and ridicule the Nazi regime, but they also perpetuated narratives difficult to verify. More revealing are testimonies from people close to the inner circle of Nazi power. Albert Speer, architect of the Reich and Minister of Armaments, wrote in his Spandau memoirs that Göring was the object of constant mockery among Nazi leaders. According to Speer, Joseph Goebbels called him Fat Aphrodite in private conversations, and Heinrich Himmler referred to him as the Empress. Christa Schroeder, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, recalled in her memoirs published in 1949 that the Führer expressed frustration with Göring's oddities. On one occasion, Hitler commented that Göring acted like an opera prima donna and that his vanity was improper for a German soldier. But the most direct testimony came from Hans Bernd Gisevius, a German intelligence officer who worked in the Abwehr and later collaborated with the anti-Nazi resistance. In his book To the Bitter End, published in 1946, Gisevius claimed to have heard from sources within the Gestapo that compromising files existed on several Nazi leaders, including Göring, related to morally questionable conduct. According to Gisevius, These files were used as internal blackmail tools, a way to maintain loyalties and prevent betrayals. Himmler supposedly kept this information as personal insurance, and the implicit threat of revealing it kept potential deserters at bay. One of the most persistent rumors refers to Göring's young personal assistants, whom they called his pages. These young men, generally under 25 years old, came from aristocratic or military families and served at Hall performing administrative and ceremonial tasks. Several testimonies suggest that Göring showed favoritism towards certain assistants, promoting their careers unusually quickly and granting them special privileges. A documented case is that of Lieutenant Werner Bross, a young Luftwaffe officer who became Göring's personal assistant in 1941. Bross received accelerated promotions and was assigned to low-risk missions throughout the war, something extremely unusual for someone of his rank. After the war, some of these assistants were interrogated by the Allies. Although none admitted to having had sexual relations with Göring, several described uncomfortable situations, long private conversations late at night, expensive personal gifts, and what one of them called inappropriate attention for a military superior. These testimonies prove nothing conclusive, but they fed the narrative that something irregular was occurring in Göring's inner circle. Analysis by modern historians. British historian Richard Overy, author of Goering the Iron Man, 2012, one of the most complete biographies of the Reich Marshal, addresses the question of sexuality from a psychological perspective. According to Overy, Göring's eccentricities do not necessarily indicate homosexuality, but rather a deep insecurity compensated with extreme ostentation. Overy argues that the 1923 groin injury may have affected Göring's sexual function, generating masculinity complexes that he tried to compensate for with displays of power and wealth. Morphine addiction, moreover, altered his hormonal balance and physical appearance, causing him to gain weight and develop characteristics that could be interpreted as effeminate. For Overy, the rumors about his homosexuality are mainly enemy propaganda and internal gossip motivated by envy or political rivalry. He points out that Göring was married twice and that private letters exist demonstrating genuine affection toward his wives, especially Emmy Sonnemann, with whom he had a daughter in 1938. However, Overy acknowledges that the documentary evidence is not sufficient to completely rule out the possibility of bisexuality. He simply argues that there is no solid proof confirming it. British historian Lawrence Rees, specialist in the Third Reich and author of The Nazis, A Warning from History, adopts a more nuanced stance. Rees highlights the fundamental hypocrisy of the Nazi regime regarding homosexuality. While the regime publicly brutally persecuted homosexuals under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, sending thousands to concentration camps, within the Nazi elite there existed a selective tolerance towards certain behaviors, as long as they were not made public and did not threaten the power structure. Rees suggests that the sexuality of leaders like Göring was deliberately ambiguous, allowing them to maintain a public image of heterosexuality, while privately they could have behaviors that contradicted that facade. Absolute power, Rees argues, generates spaces of impunity where rules applied to the population do not apply to the elite. In Göring's specific case, Rees notes that his ostentation, his aesthetic obsession, and his relationships with young assistants fit a pattern of behavior that, in other historical contexts, has been associated with homosexuality or covert bisexuality. However, he warns against definitive conclusions based solely on cultural stereotypes. German biographer Volker Ulrich, author of the monumental biography Hitler, Ascent and Fall, devotes several passages to the relationship between Hitler and Göring. Ulrich argues that Hitler was fully aware of the rumors about his subordinate, but decided to ignore them strategically. Göring was too valuable as a symbol of military respectability, as an administrator, at least in the early years, and as a charismatic public figure. Exposing or punishing him would have weakened the regime. Moreover, keeping those rumors alive gave Hitler an additional control tool over Göring, the implicit threat of public exposure. Ulrich also points out a disturbing detail. After the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered that certain Gestapo files related to the SA investigation be selectively destroyed. What did those documents contain? Did they implicate other Nazi leaders besides Rome? The destruction of evidence suggests there were secrets the regime preferred to keep buried. American historian Jeffrey Giles, specialist in sexuality and Nazism, has extensively investigated the homosexual networks that operated within the Third Reich. In his study, The Denial of Homosexuality, Same-Sex Incidents in Himmler's SS and Police, Giles documents how, despite official homophobic rhetoric, there were multiple cases of homosexual relationships among SS members and other regime bodies. Giles does not focus specifically on Goering, but his research suggests that the Nazi leadership was riddled with contradictions regarding sexuality. Many leaders who publicly persecuted homosexuality privately maintained behaviors that contradicted their discourse. According to Giles, the Nazi regime operated under a system of institutionalized double standards, where the sexuality of leaders was protected while that of ordinary citizens was brutally repressed. In this context, figures like Goering could move in a gray zone, never completely exposed, but always under suspicion. The concrete evidence, or lack thereof. Unlike Ernst Röhm, for whom explicit letters exist confirming his homosexuality, there is no direct documentation proving Göring's homosexual relationships. His letters to Emmy Sonnemann, his second wife, are consistently affectionate and show no signs of a sham relationship. However, some researchers point out that the preserved letters were probably filtered by Emmy herself after the war, when she wrote her memoirs, An der Seite meines Mann, By My Husband's Side, in 1967, a book clearly designed to rehabilitate her husband's image. It is possible that more compromising correspondence was destroyed. During his imprisonment in Nuremberg, Göring was subjected to extensive psychological interrogations. American psychologist Gustav Gilbert, who had daily access to Nazi prisoners, described Göring as a pathological narcissist with a compulsive need for admiration. Gilbert observed that Göring constantly tried to seduce his captors with personal charm, told elaborate anecdotes about his past greatness, and showed an obsessive concern about how he would be remembered by history. However, at no point during these interrogations did Göring admit or discuss his sexuality beyond references to his marriages. When asked directly about homosexuality rumors and Nazi leadership, Göring responded with contempt, calling them vulgar enemy propaganda and Judeo-Bolshevik lies. His defensive reaction neither proves nor refutes the accusations, but shows the topic was sensitive enough to provoke an emotional response. Emmy Sonnemann, Göring's second wife, always categorically denied any rumor about her husband's sexuality. In her memoirs and later interviews, she described him as a devoted husband and loving father. However, her testimony is clearly biased by the interest in protecting her own reputation and that of her daughter. Interestingly, Emmy admitted that Göring suffered from an occasional impotence due to his morphine addiction and health problems, which according to her caused episodes of depression and erratic behavior. This admission, though formulated to explain his eccentricities, also opens the door to alternative interpretations about his intimate relationships. One of the greatest mysteries is the alleged file that Himmler kept on Göring. Several post-war testimonies mention the existence of this dossier, which supposedly contained compromising information collected by the SD, the SS Intelligence Service. According to Hans Bernd Gisevius, this file included surveillance reports, informant testimonies, and possibly photographs or intercepted letters. However, if this archive truly existed, it was destroyed before the collapse of the Third Reich or remains lost in some classified archive. The lack of this key document makes it impossible to definitively confirm or deny many of the accusations about Göring. The only certainty is that Himmler used compromising information as a power tool, and that Göring lived under the constant threat of exposure. Cultural context and historical prejudices. To understand the rumors about Göring, we must examine how the Nazi regime defined correct masculinity. The Nazi ideal of the Aryan man was the Spartan soldier, disciplined, austere, heterosexual, and dedicated exclusively to the service of the state and racial reproduction. Any deviation from this model was considered degeneration. Homosexuality, in particular, was seen as an existential threat because it did not contribute to Aryan demographic expansion. The Nazis associated it with decadence, weakness, and moral corruption, which is why thousands of homosexuals were sent to concentration camps during the regime. In this context, behaviors like Göring's extreme vanity, love of luxury, theatricality were automatically interpreted as signs of effeminacy and, by extension, possible homosexuality. These judgments reflected both the prejudices of the time and the internal contradictions of the regime. Modern historians warn against the trap of interpreting the past solely through cultural stereotypes. The fact that Göring wore makeup, jewelry, and extravagant clothing does not prove his homosexuality, just as it does not rule it out. Ostentation could simply be a manifestation of his extreme narcissism, his morphine addiction, which altered his judgment, or his compulsive need to stand out in a highly competitive environment. In historical courts, from Versailles to Imperial Rome, heterosexual men have exhibited similar levels of exhibitionism without implying homosexuality. Furthermore, we must consider that many of the testimonies come from Göring's political enemies, both within and outside the Nazi regime. Accusations of homosexuality were an effective political weapon at that time, capable of destroying reputations without the need for solid evidence. Both Nazi propaganda against internal enemies and Allied propaganda against Nazi leaders used accusations of homosexuality as a delegitimization strategy. In both cases, sexuality became a symbolic battlefield. The British, in particular, produced propaganda material that sexualized and ridiculed Nazi leaders, presenting them as perverts, effeminate, or degenerate. These representations, though politically effective, were not necessarily accurate and have contaminated historical perception to this day. Therefore, separating reality from propaganda requires careful analysis of sources, their motivations, and their contexts. Not everything said about Göring was false, but not everything was true either. Alternative theories. Given the absence of conclusive evidence, various researchers have proposed alternative interpretations that attempt to explain both the persistent rumors and the lack of direct proof about Hermann Göring's sexuality. These theories are not mutually exclusive, and in some cases could complement each other to offer a more complete picture of this enigmatic Third Reich figure. Several contemporary historians suggest that, if there were any truth to the rumors, Göring might have been bisexual rather than exclusively homosexual. This interpretation would reconcile his apparently genuine marriage to Emmy Sonnemann with testimonies about ambiguous relationships with young men. Bisexuality was even less understood and more stigmatized than homosexuality in Nazi Germany, which would have made it almost impossible for someone in Göring's position to admit it publicly. If he maintained relationships with men, they would have been extremely discreet and limited to his innermost circle. However, this theory remains speculative, as there is no direct evidence of Göring's sexual relationships with men, only behaviors that can be interpreted in multiple ways. From a medical and psychological perspective, another hypothesis proposed by some specialists is that Göring's chronic morphine addiction may have significantly suppressed his libido, making him functionally asexual during much of his adult life. Morphine has known effects on the endocrine system, reducing testosterone levels and causing sexual dysfunction. If Göring suffered from chronic impotence, as his wife suggested, this would explain both the lack of evidence of intense sexual activity and his compensation through other forms of exhibitionism and power-seeking. In this scenario, homosexuality rumors would be misinterpretations of a medically suppressed sexuality, not a hidden sexual orientation. His extreme vanity, extravagant uniforms, and obsession with appearance could have been ways to compensate for a masculinity he felt diminished for physical reasons, not homosexual inclinations. From a more political and strategic angle, there exists a third theory that is especially fascinating for its cynicism: the possibility that within the Nazi leadership, there existed a system of mutual blackmail, where various leaders kept compromising secrets about each other as a way to ensure absolute loyalty. This dynamic of mutually assured destruction would function as an internal control mechanism of the regime. Göring had information about Hitler, his possible Jewish ancestry through his grandmother, rumors about his own sexuality, his role in his niece Gaily Raubel's murder. Himmler had information about Göring. Goebbels had information about both. This balance of terror ensured that no one betrayed the regime, because doing so would mean mutual exposure and the destruction of all involved. In this context, rumors about Göring could be partially fabricated or deliberately exaggerated by Himmler as a control tool, without necessarily reflecting the complete reality of his private life. The latent threat of exposure would be more valuable than the exposure itself, Keeping Göring under constant suspicion made him more manageable, more dependent on the regime's protection, and less prone to develop political ambitions that might threaten Hitler or Himmler. This theory would explain why rumors circulated widely within Nazi power circles, but never materialized into formal accusations or purges like those that eliminated Rum and the SA. What is indisputable is that Göring's sexuality, real or perceived, became a political factor in its own right. Whether true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated, the shadow of doubt surrounding it fulfilled specific functions within the Nazi power structure. It delegitimized a potential rival, provided blackmail material, and constantly reminded that no one, not even the second most powerful man in the Reich, was completely safe from the regime's surveillance and judgment. Conclusion. What can we really conclude? After analyzing period rumors, testimonies from contemporaries, analyses by modern historians, and available documentary evidence, what can we affirm with certainty about Hermann Göring's sexuality? The honest answer is not much. There is no direct documentary evidence proving that Göring maintained homosexual relationships. There are no compromising letters, photographs, or verifiable confessions. What we have are persistent rumors, behaviors that can be interpreted in multiple ways, and a political context where sexuality was used as a weapon of reputational destruction. The rumors did not arise from nothing. Göring's extreme eccentricity, his pathological vanity, his ambiguous relationships with young assistants, and his political survival in a regime that brutally eliminated other homosexuals fueled legitimate speculations. But speculation is not evidence. What we can affirm is that Hermann Göring was a profoundly complex man, marked by physical and psychological traumas, destructive addictions, and excessive ambition. His sexuality, whatever it was only one facet of a multifaceted and ultimately monstrous personality. We can also affirm that the Nazi regime operated under systemic hypocrisy regarding sexuality. While thousands of German homosexuals were persecuted, tortured, and murdered, the regime's leaders seemed to operate under different rules, protected by their power and political usefulness. The question, was Hermann Göring gay, may be less important than the questions it generates. How did power really work in the Third Reich? What secrets did its leaders use to control each other? To what extent did the public image they projected coincide with their private realities? Hermann Göring died by suicide in his Nuremberg cell on the night of October 15, 1946, a few hours before his scheduled execution. He took his secrets to the grave, and perhaps, after all, some historical mysteries are destined to remain without definitive answer. What remains undoubted is his responsibility for the Nazi regime's crimes. Whatever his sexual orientation, Göring was an architect of terror, organizer of Europe's systematic plunder, an accomplice to the Holocaust. That is the historical truth that no rumor, confirmed or denied, can overshadow. The history of the Third Reich is full of contradictions, secrets, and narratives constructed by both its protagonists and its enemies. Hermann Göring embodies those contradictions. War hero and war criminal, refined aesthete and brutal repressor, family man and possible bisexual. The search for truth about his sexuality teaches us something fundamental about history. Not all questions have clear answers, and sometimes the absence of certainty is itself revealing of how totalitarian power functions, the secrets that leaders keep, the rumors that circulate, and the implicit threats of exposure are integral parts of how authoritarian regimes function. Hermann Göring's case reminds us that history cannot always offer us definitive conclusions about intimate aspects of public figures' lives, especially when those figures lived in a context where lying, concealing, and fabricating alternative realities was an essential part of exercising power. What we can study are behavior patterns, power structures, and the ways in which sexuality became a political weapon within the Third Reich. If you found this investigation interesting, let us know in the comments. Do you believe the rumors had real foundation, or were they simply political propaganda designed to destabilize? What other controversial Third Reich mysteries would you like us to explore in depth? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to not miss the next episodes of Wartime Archive, where we continue unraveling the darkest secrets and most uncomfortable truths of modern military history. Until next time.